It's currently the middle of 2025, and I thought it'd be a good time to take a look at the current status of my server rack. I like to do these periodically so I can kind of look back and see how things have changed over time. And I also thought it'd be a good example to show how things can change and evolve over time based on your current needs and wants. And sometimes for experimentation and learning purposes. And sometimes you just want to clean up and optimize some things like I kind of want to do here. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But if you haven't watched any of my previous server rack videos, you'll see that I have two 48-port switches up here. The first one's a PoE switch, and the second one's the same switch with its non-PoE. And I have probably about 36 ports that are in my wall, and I also have a couple wireless access points up in my ceiling and an indoor PoE camera. And I also have like 4 or 5 cameras outside that I ran through the walls. So between all those devices, I have 42 to 45 ports of this 48-port switch already filled up. I like to have every port have capacity on the switch to be plugged in, even if I'll never plug every single port into a device. That way I don't have to mess around with moving ports and different things around and changing a bunch of stuff. So I like having that extra capacity to do it. And it's not that much more expensive, depending what brand of switches you get, to get a bigger switch. Like Grandstream switches are really affordable. And when I bought these two, I got them a pretty good sale on them on the site that I bought them from. So I was very pleased. Like, for example, this non-PoE switch probably costs as much or less than some 24-port switches that don't even have PoE. So I have a second 48-port switch here, which I probably could have got away with a 24-port switch, but I have almost half the switch filled up currently. So I would have almost ran out of space there. So I partially got this to make sure I have extra capacity, but also I liked it for the aesthetic of it, because you can put a 24-port patch panel above and below the network switch and have your cabling really nice like this with these half-foot patch cables. So I really did it for 2 reasons, aesthetic and future capacity, especially as I'm adding clusters and different devices here. And I'm adding a little bit of redundancy by having some replication servers and different things like that. So that those kinds of things, multi-homing devices, and just the way I architected my network and making use of multiple interfaces on these different mini PCs and various devices, you start to fill up your switches pretty quickly. So another reason I decided about these two 48-port switches is because they have 6 10 gig SFP plus interfaces on them. So instead of buying a more expensive 10 gigabit network switch that costs the same as these two switches combined, I just bought these 2 switches so I have all the gigabit capacity that I ever will need. And I'll have, and even if I connect these 2 network switches together, I still have 10 gigabit interfaces remaining. So that was very helpful for me to get a lot of 10 gig connections, because I can test things out. I can use my NAS connections, and my main PC can get fast access to the NAS and that kind of thing. And now that I've added a 3-node Proxmox cluster, those mini PCs have 10 gig interfaces. So you can see how if I'm using 1 or 2 of those interfaces on each of those devices, you can start filling up 10 gigabit interfaces pretty quickly. So Grandstream has sent me a 2.5 10 gig network switch. It's PoE++. I've been using that network switch with my new Wi-Fi 7 access points from Grandstream. They sponsored one of the access points, but I bought another one, a second one, so that I can get full coverage in my house that I want. And so they use 2.5 gig interfaces. I've been making use of that switch for that purpose, which is perfect for that. And the fact that it does PoE++ means I can run higher power devices if I want to off there. I don't currently have any that use that, I don't think. And then they sent a 10 gig SFP plus switch, which gives me some extra capacity for my Proxmox, for my cluster and stuff. So now I have like plenty of 10 gig interfaces, which will be really nice if I want to experiment and try to play around with some more 10 gig type equipment. I like having that extra capacity because I do testing of many PCs and various other devices with firewalls and stuff like that with 10 gig interfaces. So I like having that extra capacity. So another thing I did recently was I moved my Proxmox Backup Server to a different Protectli machine because I wasn't really using it that much. And it makes better use of the hardware, because this hardware on the VP2420 had a lot more capacity than I needed. So I moved it to this VP, or the V1210, and it only has 4 gigs of RAM and 32 gigs of storage. And that was perfect for the Proxmox Backup Server. You have to do a little bit of finagling to get it to install an eMMC storage, which should be okay because it's not a Proxmox cluster, so it's not going to be writing as much stuff to the disk. But I like that this hardware is about the same CPU performance, but it has fewer resources on it, but that's perfect, enough for my needs for Proxmox Backup Server. I just had to buy a new NVMe drive with a big enough capacity to store all my backups on. And then I made use of a different mini PC that I already had, which is my first mini PC that I used for OPNsense. And I'm using that as a replication, target for my Proxmox Backup Server. So I'm adding a little more redundancy. I'm going to add this second one. I haven't done it yet, but I'm going to add it to my Proxmox cluster. So if my primary Proxmox Backup Server goes down, I just pull images from my second one because it should be synced up with my first one. So that'll give me a little bit more protection if the hardware fails or get some kind of weird data corruption or something. So I like having an extra backup there. And further down, you can't see it unless I pan down in a second clip, but I have two servers down below for TrueNAS. I have my main TrueNAS server and I have a TrueNAS replication backup server. So that way my primary one backs up to my secondary, and then I have some redundancy there as well. So I'm trying to add a little more redundancy to the network, and at some point in the future I may do that with my firewall as well. I haven't really messed with that with OPNsense. It just adds, especially since my ISP only gives me one external IP, but now that I have two WAN connections, because I have a backup internet connection, I probably could make a little bit easier use of dual WAN failover type scenarios with redundant hardware. So I might explore that at some point in the future. I'm trying to avoid being too complicated, because it might be just as easy to have just a second system sitting here or a virtual machine or something that I could just spin it up if my main hardware dies. Because when I move my OPNsense off the cluster to this actual hardware, which I'm thinking about doing here pretty soon, so that to simplify some of this connection and to free up some of my 2.5 gig interfaces, because I don't have that many left, when I move that over, I can still keep that virtual machine of OPNsense ready to go. And if my main hardware fails, I can make sure it just has the same MAC address. I can just fire it up and spin up that virtual machine as a temporary thing, to get my network back up and running pretty quickly, right? So I could have either redundant physical hardware, or I could have redundant virtual hardware as well, virtualized VM. So that gives me some flexibility there with my network. For the past about year or so, I've been using OPNsense on this machine, and I've been able to live migrate the VM to this other node in the cluster. And so when I need to reboot the primary node, I can it just does it seamlessly. I really like how that works. I only have my WAN interface connected up to be redundant, and I put it on its own VLAN, and it uses like 3 interfaces because you have to connect the main modem into the switch, and then you connect your 2 systems off the switch on that same VLAN. And since only one node is active at a time, you can use a single IP between the 2 different systems, because you're really just using the same one. You're just moving it between the systems. And it worked really cool and very seamless. It's like 100 milliseconds or less, generally speaking, of how long it takes to switch over. You barely even notice the blip in the network, because it's just like a little minor latency, and then it cuts back over. Even though that's been running stable, even through major power outages, several power outages, the cluster survived, the VM survived in the power shutoff that wasn't graceful. And I was pleased with that, but I'm still going to move that VM over to the bare metal machine, because I wanted to be able to simplify some of this networking up here and free up some of my 2.5 gig interfaces. I can free up 3 of them by doing that. And I can move my firewall back to a real hardware. Because of how I've architected my network, and to have all my NAS and high throughput traffic on its own 10 gig network and various other ways that I multi-home the NAS, I don't route a lot of high throughput traffic through my firewall. So 2.5 gig interface is plenty, because most of my devices are 1 gigabit, and all the fast devices can communicate directly together, because it's either on the same network or it's connected to the back-end 10 gig network that I have set up, a VLAN for that. So I realized I could move back to this firewall that's not super powerful, but it's powerful enough for 2.5 gig routing. And you can even do most of that 2.5 gig throughput with IDS IPS enabled. I was only getting about 1.5 to 1.8 gigabits, even on this powerful mini PC from Protectli with IDS IPS enabled with ZenArmor, because I was virtualizing it and had VLANs on the same interface. So that slows things down a lot with that virtualization, even on a powerful system where the multi-threaded capabilities are a lot better than this slower system. Because I remember when I tested a slower system, I could get closer to 2 gigabits per second, which is about what I'm getting on this faster system, virtualized, right? So So I was thinking I can just have the same speed between networks with this dedicated device, and I have all my other high-speed routing off the firewall. And then that frees up a little more resources on my main server here that I've been using. I can run more apps and other VMs on there without impacting my network, right? And I don't have to worry about moving the VM between the machines, even though it's really cool when I need to reboot the main Proxmox node. I don't have to worry about migrating it first, the OPNsense VM. So that does save a little bit of hassle. And so I'll just make sure I keep configuration backups of OPNsense, and I also have ZFS snapshots as well. But as long as I keep that configuration backed up and keep a copy of OPNsense downloaded, and I also have the virtual machine I can revert back to as well, I have options, and I have several ways I can get back online pretty quickly. Yeah, so basically from like here up is like my production network, which doesn't change very much, but I do evolve it over time. And about the middle of my rack down here, you'll see that I have a bunch of devices I'm testing with. You can see a little bit on the bottom of the screen here where I have a GrandStream switch down here. I use the middle of my rack kind of as one of my test areas. I have 3 or 4 different places where I test things, and sometimes it's convenient just to have stuff here in the rack where I can connect it to different things. And down at the bottom, I have my TrueNAS and TrueNAS replication server and my UPS. All my heavy stuff's down on the bottom. So that's where I have 2/3 of this rack as my production network, and the other third is for testing purposes. Eventually, I might move all the test stuff out and shrink this rack down. And I thought about getting a shorter rack here so I can actually maybe put one on the wall here. You see this long cable here? It comes out of my ceiling and into the back of my rack, and it's like 40 cables right here or whatever. It's pretty crazy. And I thought it would be a good idea at the time just to have it like 10 or 12 feet there, have a lot of slack so I can move the server rack around anywhere I want and clean behind it, or move it to the other side of the room if I wanted to locate it there instead of on this side. But then I saw videos like Jeff Geerling and other videos and just different examples of home networks and maybe even semi-professional networks as well, where a lot of times they would terminate all the network connections on a wall mount rack, and then they'll have like the bigger racks next to it. And I really like that idea, and I don't know why that didn't click, that concept, until like recently, where I'm like, oh yeah, I should do that. I could get rid of all these long cables, have all the awkward network equipment over there that doesn't really rack very well, like my cable modem and my cellular modem, and some like my NVR and those kind of devices. I can have all that stuff just right there on the wall. And then all I have to do to get connectivity to the rest of my rack here, I can run 1 or 2 like fiber cables or DAC cables. I might do 2 just to have extra throughput between the 2 racks, do an LACP lag or something. But I was like, that would make it very easy if I want to unhook this and untether it from the rest of my network. Instead, right now, I'm really tethered with this server rack. I can't move it out or replace it or do anything because I have all these cables hooked to it. And so that I thought having a more permanent installation in that corner for a shorter wall rack, maybe 12, 15U. I thought 12U might be the bare minimum. 15U would give me a little extra capacity for some of these taller devices because that cellular modem's kind of tall. Thought about putting it on a shelf or whatever. And that'll give me just a little extra room if I want to add some more network switches or UPSs and stuff like that. So that's all I wanted to cover in this video, just to give you a quick stats of the current things and maybe a couple ideas for the future. I might circle back around either when I do this project or sometime before that if I don't get around to doing this project for quite a while. So until next time, I'm Dustin Casto, and I'll see you guys in the next video.